Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the start of a Diabetes Update webinar series. Today's webinar is on diabetes and nutrition, and it is brought to you by the Physician Learning Program and the Office of Lifelong Learning. I am Donna Manka. I'm a family physician, a professor, and the director of a research program in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Alberta. I'm also a medical director with the Office of Lifelong Learning and the Physician Learning Program in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta. The Office of Lifelong Learning is committed to providing the latest information, advice, and resources to support continued educational needs of healthcare professionals and their teams. Just before we begin tonight, I would like to go over some housekeeping slides. We acknowledge that we are on traditional territories across Canada of many First Nations, Métis, Inuit, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. I'd like to welcome our two presenters today. Dr. Rose Yeung is a clinical endocrinologist and an associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Alberta in Canada. Her research interests include diabetes, quality improvement in healthcare, and implementation science. She is also a medical director for the Office of Lifelong Learning at the University of Alberta. Dr. Yeung is passionate about patient education, empowerment, co-founding the Edmonton Zone Diabetes Resource Review Committee. She's a board member of the Type 1 Diabetes Think Tank Network, a consortium that brings together patients, healthcare providers to break down communication barriers and inform more humanistic practice, and a co-creator of the educational website diabetespregnancy.ca. She values broad community engagement and was the 2018-19 chair for the Edmonton Area Professional Section of Diabetes Canada and is a core committee member of the Alberta Diabetes, Obesity, and Nutrition Strategic Network. We also have to welcome Yeung, a registered dietitian and a certified diabetes educator with 20 years of experience and a recently completed master's in health sciences. She has been a diabetes educator at the Diabetes Clinic in Calgary and is the Nutritional Services Provincial Practice Lead for Diabetes Care in Alberta Health Services. Kim's work includes the development and dissemination of nutritional practice guidelines to support the delivery of diabetes and nutrition care in Alberta. Kim's interests in nutrition and diabetes management started in her youth when her sister and her brother were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Kim is also a mother, a wife, and an avid runner. Join me in welcoming these wonderful people. I'm sure you'll enjoy this presentation.
Hello, good evening, and thanks for joining tonight. These are our disclosures. There are no monetary disclosures to make tonight. And starting out, we've listed our objectives here, and we want to give a little caveat saying that each one of these 5 objectives could be a seminar on its own. And tonight, the point is to have a high-level review and to put things in language that you can just directly take to the clinic and to take directly to your patients. So we're going to keep the language in that type of format. So without further ado, to give some background about why we're doing this talk tonight. So yes, we know COVID is the current public health crisis on the media, but the other public health crisis that we're not talking about is that a quarter of the population lives with prediabetes or diabetes, and close to 2/3 of adults in Alberta live with being overweight or obesity. So, you know, this problem is a public health problem. It is moved beyond an individual choice problem. And I think it's really important that we frame this problem as a public health, systemic, environmental, built environment problem so that we can approach our patients with understanding and empathy and realize that this really affects us all. We also know that the diet quality for many individuals is compromised. We see that in Canada, 72.6% of adults are not eating enough fruits and vegetables, and almost half of what is intake comes from ultra processed foods. So these are very sobering statistics. And that leads us to our case to get us all thinking about the patients we see. This is one of my patients that I met in 2017. And so this young woman was diagnosed with fatty liver in 2016 and then developed diabetes in 2017. She also had hypertension and PCOS on her chart and came on metformin and birth control pill. We can see that on examination, her BMI at that time was 40. Her A1C was 6.9%. And so, we may be thinking, okay, she's 24, is 6.9 acceptable? What do we want it to be? It is technically at target, but maybe we should really be pushing that down as far as we can go there, given her age. She also has elevated LDL and triglycerides. So I just want you to think about your patients who come to you, and particularly the young patients, because I think in the younger patients, we know that there's clinical inertia. We know prescribers are less likely to prescribe younger patients medications because we know this is lifelong, and they're also facing things like childbearing and other situations where we are very reluctant to prescribe lifelong medications. But I do want to remind people that type 2 diabetes, when diagnosed younger, is actually a very atherogenic condition. And in fact, it's even more lethal than being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the same age. So we have to keep this in mind as we're thinking of our patients. And the first thing that I want to address when I see a patient like this is I want to let them know about the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes. And the way I frame it in clinic is to say, this is an energy excess problem. So we all have a set amount of energy storage capacity that is based on our genetics and on other factors that we don't fully understand, but each of us is unique. We have our own unique energy closets, so to speak. And so we take in food as our energy, and that food then goes to the liver, and the liver stores that energy as glycogen. And once the glycogen fills up, then what happens is once the liver starts getting fuller is it starts to store fat. And that's how people develop fatty liver, because the energy doesn't have anywhere to go. So it gets stored as fat and becomes fatty liver. When we go and look at the adipocytes or fat cells, they fill up and up and up. And at a certain point, they say, we're full. Don't put any more energy storage into fat. And the fat cells get upset and start spewing out inflammatory markers and not accepting glucose. And that we can term something like insulin resistance. Same thing with the muscles, is that the muscles, they get too much energy. They actually can start to fill up with fat. There are studies showing that cells, including things like myocytes, can be infiltrated with fat. And then at a certain point, they say, we're full, we don't want any more energy. And so what happens? That energy gets stuck in the bloodstream in the form of blood glucose, causing hyperglycemia and diabetes. And so a big driver of this problem has been attributed to the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. So some of you may have heard about this model of obesity, where we understand that a major driver of insulin production and hyperinsulinemia is carbohydrate. And so when people take in excess energy intake in the form of carbohydrates, the body will make insulin. The insulin will shuttle that energy from the bloodstream into different places, including storage as fat. And then, as I mentioned, those cells get full. They don't want to accept any more energy. And as a result, create inflammation and havoc, and people feel tired and hungry and continue to go around in the vicious cycle. Now, I think this is a concept that is useful to get people to consider the kinds of food that they're taking in and to reflect on the quality of food, particularly when it comes to refined carbohydrates. But we have to acknowledge that the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity is not the whole story. It's part of the story. It may be more contributory to certain individuals, but it is definitely not the whole story. And it doesn't talk about the microbiome or how the satiety center works. And there's very complex gene interactions, but I think it still is a useful concept to bring up with some patients. Now, the other point I want to bring up is that we have classically been trained that type 2 diabetes is a progressive chronic condition. And over time, there's this concept that, eventually things will fall apart and people will develop complications, and that's that. And I think we now have much better data suggesting that it does not have to be a progressive disease to the extent that we believed before. So this is a really important study that was performed in the UK in the primary care setting called the DIRECT study. And they now have 2-year follow-up data that they have published. And in this study, they divided people into this very intensive low energy intervention versus the usual care group that got followed by the family physician and the team members as per standard UK guidelines, which are similar to Canadian guidelines. Now, in the direct intervention, what they did was for 3 months, they put these people on a very calorie restricted, I should say energy restricted diet, including shakes. So they were prepackaged shakes. And then after 3 months, they were transitioned back to normal food and encouraged to have activity. Now, the findings in the usual care group is probably similar to what a lot of us see in practice, is that very few had remission, the majority remain on medications, and very few are able to lose a substantial amount of weight. In the direct intervention after 2 years, we can see that 21% dropped out, but just over 10% had lost at least 15 kilograms. 36% were still in remission as defined by an A1C of less than 6.5 off medications, and 40% remained on medications, albeit usually lower doses. So I think the results speak for themselves. And, when I saw this, I thought, why aren't we promoting more of these types of practices? And the authors of this study really are on a mission to say, this is feasible and doable in primary care. But I think it's good for us to all reflect on this kind of data and think about how we are counseling our patients and what kind of options we're providing for our patients, because people are making remission possible. And here's from word on the street is Diabetes Canada will be having a chapter on diabetes remission in the near future. So hopefully we have that to look forward to. And ultimately, the message is we need to give people hope. We need to give people hope that this problem of energy excess can be remedied and that people don't have to just live in fear of developing diabetes complications all their life. We need to give them agency and hope to be able to uh, turn the tide. So, we want to frame the office discussion around 4 things that we can work on together. And those 4 things are what you eat, how much you eat, when you eat, and how you eat. And the first thing we're going to talk about is what you eat, and recognize that not all calories are created equal. So every picture on this slide represents 100 calories worth of food. And you can just obviously see your body is not going to treat the gummy bears and the cookies the same way it treats the green beans and the shrimp. They are completely different kinds of mechanisms of absorption, of metabolism, different hormones are involved. And so for those people who do calorie banking and who say, okay, well, I'm going to eat 1,200 calories, but I'm going to save up my calories and just eat Snickers bars, it is not an advisable method because it's more complex than that. And that is to say, a calorie is not a calorie. And that concept of calories in equals calories out has now largely been debunked. And as Dr. Arya Sharma likes to say, biology is not physics, and our bodies are not calorimeters that just, expend energy in the way that we measure in a combustible calorimeter. So I think it's really important that we recognize food quality is important and that calories are different. And we don't just keep on pushing this eat less mantra in terms of when it comes to straight up calories.
That was a great, Rose, great segue into, so what we do have in our toolbox to help promote perhaps a better quality diet. And there are definitely a variety of dietary approaches that we can use that can have all been shown to improve cardiovascular risk factors, including managing weight, blood glucose, and blood lipid levels. And listed here on this slide are various dietary patterns that are discussed in the nutrition chapter of the 2018 clinical practice guidelines published by Diabetes Canada. And when we look at these different types of dietary approaches, there is one commonality, and that is that they tend to promote high quality diets, which include eating lots of vegetables and fruit in varying degrees. Lots of them will encourage eating things like berries or your lower glycemic index fruits, such as maybe apples or pears. They also encourage choosing foods that are rich in unsaturated fats, like your nuts and seeds and fish. And they're also encouraged choosing higher fiber foods or carbohydrates that are lower on the glycemic index. And so we also need to recognize that we don't have to just pick one approach. A lot of these can be kind of mixed and matched. So we can maybe try a low carbohydrate type of diet using the principles of the low glycemic index, and also bring in some of the Mediterranean concepts around that as well. So we certainly have many tools in our toolbox. Next slide, thanks. Thanks, Rose. And to just address the lower carbohydrate diets, which have gained in popularity over probably the last, I'd say, 5 years now. Now, Diabetes Canada in the summer, they did acknowledge that these types of diets have grown in popularity and did publish a position statement on these diets. It is important to recognize that there is no formal definition of what a low carbohydrate diet looks like, but what's on this slide here aligns with what Diabetes Canada has in their position statement, as well as what you will find when you read the literature about low carbohydrate diets. And actually, I often refer to these diets as reduced carbohydrate diets because there's different levels, and it's really important, I believe, to define if a person is choosing a low carbohydrate diet, or a reduced carbohydrate diet, defining the level of restriction of carbohydrates that is intended. And one of the things I bring this up is because I've commonly heard both patients and healthcare providers or friends and family say, oh yeah, you know, I have a friend that's gone on a keto diet, or I want to do a keto diet. But then when you dive into it deeper, really what they mean is they've stopped eating bread, and which is really not true a ketogenic diet. It's really more of just a lower carbohydrate diet. And so we also want to be clear in what extent that carbohydrate is restricted, because it might change our approach in terms of how we might manage the patient. It might inform what medications might need to be adjusted, as well as maybe what other biochemical markers we might want to monitor, such as maybe monitoring for nutrient deficiencies. And so typically the literature does describe low carbohydrate diets as those that contain less than 30 grams of carbohydrate per day. And where this number comes from is that this is the recommended daily allowance, or the RDA, for carbohydrates according to the National Institute of Medicine. And then your very low carbohydrate, high fat diets, or really your potentially ketogenic diets, are restricted to less than 50 grams of carbohydrate per day, and often with the intent to induce that nutritional ketosis. But at this level, this is meaning cutting out basically whole food groups, which include like your grain products, most of your fruits. So there are certainly, we can acknowledge there's been shown to be many benefits with cutting out the carbohydrates from the diet or reducing them. They include improved in blood sugar control, improvements in insulin resistance, improvements in body weight and body composition, as well as there can be varying degrees of improvements in the lipid levels. And quite consistently, we'll see triglycerides drop, but there can be a mixed effect with the LDL cholesterol. And fortunately, Rose is going to talk a little bit more about that later on in our presentation. So, because that's a little bit beyond my scope. So I look forward to her explaining that a bit more to us. And then also we have to acknowledge that with any treatment really, but this as well, there's potential adverse effects. So if the diets are not implemented maybe in the most healthiest manner, or if we're not monitoring them close enough, then people can be at increased risk of maybe developing gallstones, bone diseases, kidney stones. Some people might experience hair loss, especially those true ketogenic diets where even protein is restricted. Certainly, like I said, nutrient deficiencies, more notably things like magnesium and selenium, some of your B vitamins. And then there is also a risk of hypoglycemia or euglycemic DKA, and this has to do with the medications that people are taking. So if people are taking any medications for their diabetes that impose a risk of hypoglycemia, so most notably, of course, your insulin or your insulin secretagogues, considering needing to cut back on those, or Rose, I know, has another session coming up on de-prescribing medications. As well, we need to acknowledge that there is an increased risk of euglycemic DKA when people have a reduced carbohydrate intake and they're taking SGLT2 inhibitors. So that is certainly a caution that people need to watch out for. All right, now how much sugar should we consume? Well, apparently we as a population are consuming way too much, which I feel that should be no surprise to any of us. It has been found that back about a decade ago or so, based on Canadian population studies, that we on average consuming about 26 teaspoons of sugar a day, which equals about 400 calories from sugar, which is outstanding. WHO and Diabetes Canada does recommend that we limit our added sugar intake to less than 10% of energy. But these organizations have also recognized that there's potentially further health benefits if we reduce our intake to less than 5% of our energy per day. So that amount equals to about 6 teaspoons of sugar per day, which is 20 teaspoons less than what our population is currently consuming on average. So we got some work to do. And so there are some simple food swaps that we can do. And one thing that we should acknowledge is that really a lot of this added sugar comes from these highly ultra processed foods that that we do consume. And as Rose mentioned in the introduction, we as a society are consuming almost 50% of our energy as ultra processed foods. So I think we have some places to work on. Here there are examples of a couple of these ultra processed foods in which if we just switch them to less processed varieties, so for instance, your yogurt, if you went from a fruit flavored yogurt to just a plain yogurt, maybe throw some berries on there for some flavor, you could drop right in that serving, your sugar intake by 5 teaspoons, or switching just from a regular pop to more of just like a fizzy, like a soda drink, a carbonated water, maybe flavored with some lime. Again, you can drop it out by an outstanding 8 to 10 teaspoons of sugar per can.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little commentary there. I always bring up the yogurt example in clinic because it's crazy. Those tiny little yogurt containers are just little sugar bombs. And people just have no idea. They think, oh, I'm eating something healthy because it's fruity and it's yogurt and it has protein and no fat. And all of a sudden, it's super eye-opening to many people.
Yeah, there's a lot. Ultra processed foods. I mean, like Rose said, we could provide whole new seminars on this topic. But other examples, in case those of you are interested, what is an ultra processed food? So you're ready to eat cereals, breakfast cereals, your packaged cookies and crackers, just to name a few. Even our milk alternatives, like your almond milks and flavored, coconut milks and stuff like that. Those have added sugar to them if you don't choose the unsweetened kind. So just be wary.
Yes, buyer beware for sure.
All right, so and then despite what we have become accustomed to think, dietary fat is not a 4-letter word. Now, a couple of decades ago, certainly, like I said, I've been working for 20 years as a dietitian, and I know when I first entered the profession, this was still what we talked a lot about is low-fat diets. And there's several reasons for that, because they are, first of all, fat gram per gram is quite energy dense compared to your carbohydrates and proteins. And they were also recognized to potentially increase cardiovascular risk. But certainly the narrative about this has changed, and it's recognized that dietary fat does have many advantages for metabolic health. It's now recognized that replacing our refined or high glycemic index carbohydrate foods with unsaturated and unprocessed fats, such as nuts and seeds, can improve cardiovascular risk factors, such as our fasting glucose, LDL cholesterol, and lowering triglycerides. In addition, research is discovering that saturated fat, which has been perceived in the past as bad type of fat due to its ability to increase cholesterol levels, is not as closely linked to cardiovascular disease as we previously thought. And this is especially found in the context of lower carbohydrate intakes. And also, I've been encouraged to point out that this information has been recently published and is becoming accepted by the American College of Cardiology. So hopefully we'll start to see again that narrative flush through a lot of our patient education messaging.
Yes, and so to continue on that theme, things that we can do to reduce hyperinsulinemia in the context of energy excess is obviously reduce the refined grains and sugars, choose lower glycemic index carbs. And the way I put it is, I say to patients, pick foods that your body has to do the work to process. If the work has already been done and the food has already been milled and pulverized and reformed and fried, that's not a good choice. You need to pick something that comes closer to how it came in nature. And when it comes to things like brown rice, it makes a real difference. So if we compare brown rice to white rice in terms of equivalent amounts, in terms of mass. When you stick a continuous glucose monitor and measure insulin in individuals who eat the same amount of brown rice versus white rice, we see a 20 to 30% decrease in glucose excursion and in insulin under the curve. So it is not a small effect. It can be a very big effect, which arguably is like the effect of a medication, if not more. We also have to consider what Kim just said about good fat, and the things that I want to talk about are eggs and full fat dairy. We need to get people to not be afraid to eat eggs and full fat dairy. I think that there's been a lot of fear around that, and people still think, oh no, eggs, cholesterol. I think that story has been debunked. And we want to encourage adequate but not excess protein intake. Oops.
So one of the take-home messages I'm really hoping to you take with you today is that diet quality matters. And so regardless of the dietary approach that anyone chooses, it's important to focus on that diet quality and the nutrient density rather than just the distribution of carbohydrates, protein, and fat in the diet. And for example, although these two plates here provide similar amounts of protein, carbohydrate, and fat, the one on the left is going to provide more fiber, less saturated fat, although Rose just spoke to that, but there's different types of good and bad. But more importantly, it's going to have higher levels of those unsaturated fats as well, and also higher levels of micronutrients. And it's certainly in better alignment with the dietary patterns we mentioned earlier. And let's face it, it kind of looks nicer too. So how much a person eats, either in total for the day or at one time, certainly can impact our health. Encouraging patients to become more aware of and manage their portion sizes is a strategy that can support both good glycemic as well as weight management. There are many tools that we can use to help do this. I think most of us are familiar with the healthy plate model or that Canada's Food Guide kind of healthy plate. Those plates, of course, encourage half the plate as vegetables, a quarter of it as your starches or your whole grains, and a quarter of it is your protein-rich foods. But another simple tool that I often use in my practice, and I think many other dietitians do as well, is just the hand portion guide shown on this slide here. This is a resource that is available through Diabetes Canada. And on here, it shows the size of a woman's fist, which is about equivalent to 1 cup. And also encouraging the amount of vegetables to be the amount that you can hold in both hands, and trying to consume this amount at your meals. An adequate protein portion or meat portion would be the size of a person's palm of their hand and thickness of their pinky. And for women, that equals to about 3 ounces of meat. And then sometimes I'll use the tip of the thumb as an example of what type of, how much added fat to add to the meals if you're putting it like maybe on a bread or a salad dressing, oil on a salad and that sort of things. And so I do find it is practical to use your patient's hands to help demonstrate the portion sizes that you might be recommending. Certainly, I've seen lots of large men. And so, one of my common I'll ask them to show me their fist and ask them how much of that they would eat of like rice or pasta or whatever the carbohydrate is that they like to consume. And then I'll ask, do you think you can eat half of that, right? In terms of your fist size. And so just having a conversation. And the other nice thing about using hands is they're always with you. And so people can even just gauge their portion sizes using their hands. I also use these tools when doing nutrition assessments. So trying to get and if I don't have any of my magic little fake plastic food models, then just asking them, well, okay, well, how much is that? Could you hold it in your hand that you consume? Or, if you have a bowl of cereal, would it fit in both your hands, or would it be overflowing? That sort of thing, just to help understand really how much a person is eating.
And then we come to question 3, when are you eating? And now the rage is intermittent fasting. I'm sure somebody in your circle has brought up intermittent fasting. It's in the lay media a lot, and for good reason. because it works. And I want to point for those who are really interested in molecular mechanisms and want to do, a close look at the literature around it. There was a review in the New England Journal in 2019 on fasting that was really helpful. But effectively, fasting as a practice that has lasted time immemorial, practiced by many cultures and religions around the world for spiritual and physical cleansing. And what we now know when we look at these molecular mechanisms is that if we give the body time to rest and we rest it long enough so that it eats through all the glycogen and switches to, as Kim had mentioned, nutritional ketosis or using other substrates other than glucose for energy, what happens is that the body then starts to scavenge other things for energy and does something called autophagy, which is effectively cellular spring cleaning, getting rid of the junk in the cell. And these benefits have been seen to be independent of weight loss, which is really positive. So fasting as a practice has really fascinating scientific basis. And I think this is another therapeutic modality that we are underusing. Now, in the review I brought up, this was a sample prescription of fasting, so also known as time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating. And basically, you can see here the protocol sort of advances across months, and you can either do, a number of days a week where you restrict the eating time, or you can pick certain days of the week. The common way is called 5-2, where 2 days of the week you restrict the energy, and then the 5 days you eat your normal amounts of energy. And a very useful office resource that I give to patients all the time is this guide called Intermittent Fasting for Beginners, written by Dr. Jason Fung, who is a nephrologist out of Toronto. He's also written some books very popular with lay people called The Obesity Code, The Diabetes Code, and a number of books on fasting. And it's really a very practical introduction that patients can access for free. And I think it is a very, very good resource. So when we come back to my patient, I did bring up some of these principles with her, and we talked about, lower carbohydrate diets. We talked about intermittent fasting. So you can see here in 2017, when I met her, things were not going so well. Her ALT at that time was 185. Then 2018, sort of more of the same. And then I tried to put her on liraglutide, and she took it for a few months and found it, she could not tolerate it. She felt very sick on it. She didn't lose weight on it, but she was really motivated to change something. And that's when she started doing intermittent fasting, where she would eat one meal a day for most days of the week. And she started doing a lower carbohydrate diet, where she cut out the processed sugars, and she was focusing on eating vegetables and good quality proteins. And look at what happened. It's just astonishing that her weight dropped 32, 33 kilograms. She also had normalization of her ALT. And then what we do see is that her LDL did increase. And so I just followed up with her this week and after coming back from mat leave, and she says, well, I saw my family doctor, and my family doctor was worried about my LDL and told me that I should be eating less saturated fat and reintroducing more of the whole grains. So my approach is I am going to measure her ApoB levels, because ApoB levels will tell us whether these are fluffier, less atherogenic LDL versus more atherogenic LDL. So ApoB is a marker of atherogenicity, and if the ApoB is normal or lower, I would not be worried about the LDL. So these are some considerations around the lipid levels.
And so now we'll just address in one short slide how you eat. And again, another topic we could expand upon. But how you eat is certainly important and it certainly influences what, how much, and when you eat. Mindless eating can cause people to overeat and feel unsatisfied. So as demonstrated here, eating in front of screens, you kind of all of a sudden just inhale everything and you can't even remember eating, which I think is pretty common behavior. Planning and preparing for meals in advance can certainly help people bring in an element of mindfulness and awareness to one's eating behaviors. And I've just shown on this slide here 2 concepts that have certainly gained in popularity. So mindful intuitive eating. And both of these concepts build on similar principles in which include honoring one's own body and bringing in non-judgmental awareness to both the person's internal eating cues, which would be things like hunger, as well as external eating cues, such as just basically seeing a plate of cookies on the counter. The major differences between these 2 concepts is that mindful eating may include a more structured approach, including some meditation practice, whereas intuitive eating is based more on a set of principles. And I just bring this forward because we are seeing more research in this area. And there has been recently published a couple of cross-sectional studies in people with type 2 diabetes that have shown that people who have higher mindfulness and intuitive eating scores do have better quality diets. They do have a better level of self-care and overall better glycemic management. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about these concepts and how we can apply these in our practice as well as the future.
And now just a word on personalizing nutrition with the biofeedback devices we now have available. So here pictured is the Libre, the Freestyle Libre, which is a flash glucose monitor. Many of you are familiar with it. They're the sensors that one can wear in the arm for 2 weeks and scan with either the device shown or a smartphone and allow people to have an every 5-minute understanding of what their blood glucose is doing relative to their eating and activity habits. And I have to say, this is a game changer. And so far, these devices are indicated in people who are on insulin, but I can tell you people who are not on insulin also benefit if they are having difficulty understanding what their blood glucose are doing day to day. And so we will talk more about this in deprescribing insulin in our seminar 4. If you've got more questions about that, tune in. But I want to say, these tools are really helpful because a carb is not a carb. All foods are not created equal, and the way the body metabolizes them is unique. And so these really give people that personalized understanding. I was talking to a patient today who was telling me, oh yeah, when I eat the sushi rice, it makes my sugars shoot up. But when I eat the sourdough bread, my sugars are okay. And so, like I say, not all carbs are created equal, and it does allow people to have that in the moment understanding of what's happening to their bodies.
Yeah, and just to build further on that personalized medicine approach, I think it's important to remember that there are many factors that influence our food choices and behaviors. And as shown here is a food literacy framework from the Public Health of Ontario that I like to use that helps me to understand how these factors interplay and how they can act as either facilitators or barriers to helping people change their food choices and behaviors. For an example, if a person is maybe wanting to try a lower carbohydrate diet, they would need a certain level of nutrition knowledge around, dietary carbohydrates. We'd also have to maybe look at the food skills that they would need to adopt in terms of how they would shop for food, or even how they might prepare foods differently. There also is absolutely a level of self-efficacy and confidence that a person needs in order to be able to successfully implement these changes. And then we cannot ignore the external factors that play on behavior change. So such as family and friends and different cultural beliefs, and how those can maybe either enhance or support that behavior change, but how they can also be maybe barriers to making these changes. And these are things I know a lot of my dietitian colleagues consider when they assess patients and counsel their patients. And I do encourage everybody to keep that in mind when discussing nutrition and making some dietary changes. So to start to wrap up, let's just consider more of an office approach to nutrition. And so one of the things I really enjoyed about collaborating with Rose on this is that I think it speaks to how we as healthcare providers need to create a supportive environment to share new evidence that has come through, to discuss it, have good dialogue about it, and make sure when we see our patients, and especially when we're sharing the care of the patients, that we have consistent messaging to the patients. And one of the things I explained to Rose is, I work at a provincial level, so support a lot of dietitians across the province. And often I'll hear about dietitians coming to me and say, Kim, I just got this referral for a ketogenic diet, and that's all it says is ketogenic diet. I don't know what to do with this. Like, what does the physician mean? And I just encourage them to, reach out to the physician, understand what the patient needs. Does the patient even know what this is? And really understand what it is we're trying to achieve with this referral.
Yeah, and that also has to do with starting with where the patient is and recognizing where the patient is coming from, and working on doing it without judgment so that we can build trust to have those longitudinal relationships, and to realize that, one size does not fit all when it comes to nutrition therapy. People are coming from all different kinds of backgrounds, with all different kinds of preconceptions about food and knowledge about food, and even concepts like food dignity, and we need to start to listen to where they're coming from, and just start there.
And then also when working with, of course, our patients, I think we all understand this concept. I hope we do, that working on those small incremental changes can have big impacts in the end. So focusing on successes and their strengths. Often I know dietitians will use making SMART goals that are really behavior focused. So making sure we're setting up our patients for success. One of the things that we try to avoid actually is that we're encouraged as dietitians to avoid is setting those weight loss goals as the end goal, and really focusing more on behaviors, because that ultimately is what patients can control, is their behaviors. So focusing on that more. And then we also have here combining hope and purpose to create motivation. And this is a concept I actually have on my board here. I give our patients hope, like Rose said in the beginning. Tell them that it is possible to take control and manage your blood sugars, and maybe find why that might be important to the person. Like for instance, in Rose's case scenario there, she's a young woman. Do you want to have family? We can work together to make sure you have a healthy pregnancy if that's the goal. And so combining that hope and purpose to create that motivation.
And ultimately taking that personalized quality improvement approach, measuring, monitoring, and figuring out what works for that individual. Because ultimately that's what we do as clinicians, and we just have to measure, try something, measure it, see if it works. If it doesn't work, try something else. And as we come to wrap up here, we just wanted to give a few easy tips to remember to talk about with your patients. So the first one is food quality. And what I like to get people to do is think mechanistically. Think about how fast that sugar gets absorbed. And so eat rather than drink energy, because drinking energy is like slamming your pancreas with sugar. Like it gets absorbed so fast. We treat hypoglycemia with liquid sugars because it works fast. Okay, the next thing is no naked carbs as a concept. So if people are eating carbohydrate or starchy foods, dress it up with some protein, some fat, some fiber, so that that carbohydrate has buffer around it to slow it down, and actually comes to the next point of taking in vegetables first. The Japanese have done some really cool studies looking at reductions in glucose excursion based on eating vegetables first. So starting with a salad, that is a great approach. And to make salad or make vegetables taste better, make them sexy, add some good fats to them. Don't skimp on the olive oil when it comes to, you know, cooking your vegetables or dressing them up. Chia seeds, just want to shout out to the chia seeds right here. You know, fiber like chia seeds are really another way to improve or I should say reduce the glucose excursion. So, bonus is they're really good for gut motility. And so if people are complaining of constipation, get them to take 1 to 2 tablespoons of chia seeds a day and see if that helps. And the 3 S's, soups, salad, and stir fry are your friends when eating and eating out. These things may be better choices.
And then certainly, you know, using portion guides, easy portion guides, if that is part of the goal of the nutrition therapy, using your plate model hand portions, which I described.
And the next one is, you know, giving patients the concept of resting your body from energy processing is a good thing. Giving your body a break, simplifying your life, you know, it's something you don't have to do. You don't have to prepare another meal because you're giving your body a break. And I think the big thing about fasting is tailoring it and personalizing it. And it may start with something as simple as, can you not eat after dinner? Can you just stop eating at night? And we know, like, there are people who have night eating syndrome where they eat 25% of their calories after dinner. And it's you know, considered a negative condition to have. So I think we need to start talking about fasting as a therapeutic modality more often.
And then bringing in some mindfulness. So using the 4 Ps, you know, plan ahead, prepare the foods ahead, pack and portion. And also, again, going with that mindfulness theme, listening to your body. So being more aware of how you're eating, what you're eating, and making sure you understand whether you're eating out of habit or is it out of hunger. And here on the screen is just a few resources that are available through AHS. So Alberta Health Services does have nutrition practice guidelines that are available for dietitians that work within AHS and primary care networks. And they have been recently updated, included additional sections, including a section on reduced carbohydrate diets, fasting, both intermittent and for religious reasons, such as Ramadan, and also discussing the coordination of care for prescribing medications. AHS also has nutrition education resources for all healthcare providers, which are available on the external website. And then, of course, there's Diabetes Canada, a CPG chapter on nutrition, as well as the more recent low carbohydrate diet position statement. And also, they have a couple patient education resources, which we tend to use, which is the Glycemic Index Guide and the Basic Carbohydrate Counting.
So our take-home messages are: one diet does not fit all. We have to recognize that upfront. And if something doesn't work, that's okay. Try something different. We want you to take home four things to improve and to ask about in clinic: the what, the how much, the when, and the how to eat. We want to recognize that good nutrition is a set of behaviors that requires ongoing support. It's not a one and done prescription. And we need to really understand the personal and cultural context. And we need to be able to refer when people are ready to be referred, particularly to nutrition. Any last minute comment on that, Kim?
Well, I mean, one of the problems I think we have is the dietitians are not always easily available for all providers, but certainly, partner up with any dietitians that you do work with. And then I do just encourage you, I know not all patients want to see a dietitian, but please continue to encourage them to consider it. And we love to see patients who are ready and willing to make some changes.
And give people hope. Let's go out there and give people hope and tell people it does not have to be a chronic, debilitating condition, that there is hope out there. So we've made some links and a word on dietdoctor.com. So I'm a big fan of some of the resources on this website, and I know some of my dietitian colleagues are not such big fans. And when I do tell people to go to this site, I give them a warning and I say it is very pro ketogenic, very pro low carb information. But what I really like is the intermittent fasting guide. And I really like the visual guides because they're really pictorial and people can easily see, get a relative understanding. And, I warn them that there's a subscription bit, but I say there are some free things that are useful to look at. And we can talk about, the kind of approach to take. It does not have to be ketogenic, but this information may be useful. And with that, I'll get to the questions.
Thank you so much, Kim and Rose, for an excellent presentation. We have quite a few questions, so we'll go through a few of these. One, I think, is to Rose, and that's Kan Lee, asks, did the intervention group in the direct trial get any extra counseling, coaching, support to help them adhere to the diet? That was in the early part of the presentation.
The intervention or the usual care? The intervention?
Intervention.
Yes, there was quite a rigorous protocol around supporting the patients, but it was done in a way that was meant to be pragmatic and in a kind of fashion that could be carried out in usual care in terms of frequency. I can't remember exactly, and it changed throughout the protocol. But yes, there were additional behavioral support guidance around that, but it was delivered by a usual UK primary care team.
And the second question is from Ki Long Sit, and it is my understanding that the average man needs 2,500 calories per day. What portion should be carbs? And the average woman needs about 2,000 per day. Is the right amount of calories that I quoted?
Well, certainly our energy needs will vary. It's what is the average man and the average woman is, I mean, I mean, those calorie energy levels are probably not far off, I would say. But the carbohydrate requirements, again, that it's quite variable, and that's where the dietitians come in and do their individual assessments. And again, it depends on our dietary approach that we're going to be trying.
Yeah, and I think this is the problem with calories in, calories out, and calorie counting in general. So I can tell you, if I ate 2,000 calories, and depending on what kind of calories a day, I would likely be gaining weight. I don't think somebody my size, I don't need that much food. And so I think this is the issue, is most of the time, and when we're talking about type 2 diabetes, we have a problem of energy excess. So we want people to recognize they are taking too much energy and say, where can we reduce the energy and how can we reduce the energy? And so I think what would make sense is figure out how many calories they're eating now, or, you know, sort of amounts of food they're eating, and then try and modify in terms of food quality. So talking about the what and the how much and the when and the how.
And the another question or comment was, I just lost it, but it was around if there are 3 teaspoons of sugar in white bread, how do you limit it? Which is
Yeah, I see that. And so again, so many concepts here I'd love to take the time to expand on. So when we talk about, so the equivalent amount of carbohydrates in a piece of bread is about the equivalent amount you'd find in 3 teaspoons of sugar. But what you find in bread is actually starch. And this speaks to the glycemic index. Oh my goodness, I would love to do a whole seminar on this issue in itself. So how do we keep, so white bread is not sugar. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about actual teaspoons of sugar that are added to our foods, and these, specifically these ultra processed foods.
But yeah.
And I'm unable to show the further questions and answers on my screen. I don't know if, and we're a little past 8. I think we're going to have to finish the talk at this point. You know, so we do really appreciate you know, the excellent presentation from our presenters. And we really are interested in your feedback. You know, so do take time to fill in the evaluation form. We're also interested in anybody who'd be interested in co-creating with PLP. We love to work with you. There are projects where you can get involved and create very useful tools and resources, you know, that can help you in your practices. You know, so if you're interested in volunteering, do. It's a great team. You know, so thank you again. Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Kim. Outstanding presentation. And we look forward to people coming again in a week. We've got a number of presentations lined up.
Right. So next week is diabetes and chronic kidney disease with Dr. Menka and Dr. Darren Lau joining. And, you know, please do consider the co-creation tools, because we are looking for clinicians out there who are interested in co-designing tools that you can use in your office. So one of the things that Nandini and I are hoping to do is create some tools around insulin deprescribing. So we're going to have a session on it, but we are going to also try and make some resources for this later on. So please click on the link and sign up for our notifications on what we're doing. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a great night.